I've been sat with you for the first part of this conference. It's been absolutely remarkable and very, very significant. And hopefully I can add to the conversation that we're having on a very, very broad front. And I think picking up what David has just said about purpose, I kind of would absolutely reinforce that as we go forward. In my experience, I first became chief executive, as David said, in 2006 against a background of significant change in the NHS. We had at those times, those of you remember, a big deficit across the NHS as a whole. We had a gross deficit over £1 billion. We had a reforming government, a Prime Minister who was committed to changing the way in which the NHS operated, and my diagnosis of that position at that particular period in time was exactly what David's was there, that the senior leadership of the NHS, and I was part of it in those circumstances, lost the plot. We lost the reason why we were there. We got so excited about all of the changes, foundation trusts, payment by results, practice-based commissioning, a whole series of processes that we sort of lost why we were there, to improve outcomes and quality for patients. And indeed, while we were getting excited about dealing with that all over there, on Ward 10 in Mid-Staffordshire Hospital, really bad things were happening. And that lesson is one that I certainly learned and understood at the time, and it is increasingly important as we go through the period that we are currently going through. And this is relevant both to England, Wales, Ireland and Scotland. In fact, most major health systems in the world are facing the kind of challenges that we do. And focusing your attention on purpose during that period is critical. And particularly for us in the NHS. Claire Gerarda earlier talked about watching the Olympic opening ceremony, and I watched it like her, and I was moved by what I saw. It shows, I think, in all sorts of ways, that the NHS is not a series of autonomous organisations all operating together in some kind of market. It's a social movement. It's a set of values and principles. It's the people who work in it and the population that supports it. When you bring all of those things together, then you can understand what the NHS is. And that's what we need to do as we go through this process. Now, the Olympics were fantastic. At the time, we had health ministers from all over the world coming into London to meet us, and they were all completely bowled over by that opening ceremony and started to ask us all kinds of questions about the NHS. Why was it that your health system was in your opening ceremony? The Americans couldn't have imagined that happening in theirs, and neither could many of the health ministers that we had there. And they started to get very interested in the NHS in a way perhaps they hadn't understood or done before. And the single thing that they focused their attention on, which is interesting given that the Olympic opening ceremony focused attention on hospital beds, but the interesting thing that they all focused their attention on was the power of primary care, the power of general practice. How could we do this in this country? And there was huge interest. Claire Gerard and her team came to do a presentation to some of them, but huge interest in how primary care and general practice could be the base on which you could build a sustainable healthcare system in their particular countries. And it's really reflects, I think, on the work that the college and general practice have done across the country that we were in that particular place. And it was an absolutely remarkable set of meetings that we had at that time. Whether it was the Americans interested, Kaiser interested particularly about the way in which general practice was developing in this country, the Chinese delegation were interested, Singapore, you name it, and they were interested in what you were doing, what we were doing in the NHS around primary care. Now, you all know the kind of scale of challenge that we face. It's well rehearsed, the demographic changes, the changes in medical technology, the expectation of our patients, All of those things driving a service, and we know of the restricted financial position that we find ourselves in. And there's no doubt in my mind that as we go through that, holding on to that purpose of a NHS free at the point of delivery, available to all our patients universally, but not only that, for us to seek out those people for a whole variety of reasons that have difficulty connecting with us, is a critical purpose for us to hold on to. Now, we're making some changes in England. I think the principles apply across most of the developed world, but primary care, general practice, has to be the centre point of how we do that. It's the centre point for us in England in relation to commissioning, and by commissioning I mean the planning and organisation and delivery of service. It's not a complex science on its own, it's relatively straightforward. And what we know is that commissioning led by clinicians based on a population base is much more likely to get you the kind of outcomes that we want for our patients than some of the alternatives that might be available. And that's why, in commissioning terms, the practice is the base on which everything is built. The practice that is a population, so a responsibility for a defined group of people, some of whom are in connection with general practice, but some that aren't, having the responsibility to look after the totality of the health needs of that population, is critical. And general practice is in a particularly unique place to make that happen, whether it be your understanding of your local neighbourhoods, your communities, but also the way in which you can see the NHS, the way you can see the navigation of patients through that system as we go along. And of course, many of you will know something that's oft quoted, which is if every general practitioner referred one less patient to hospital a week and asked for one less blood test, it would save the NHS £500 million. Now I'm not saying you should do that, because it's very important we get all of that right. All I'm saying in that is relatively small changes, micro changes in practice can have a massive impact on the NHS overall. So really, really important that we build commissioning on the practice. But we know the practice on their own can't do everything. You need to build practices together, hence the development of clinical commissioning groups. And for those of you who are engaged and involved in this, thank you very much for the incredible commitment people have been having in these circumstances for a whole variety of reasons. Some people because they want to do commissioning, some people because they're fed up of seeing other people getting it wrong and they want to get it right, some people who want to change service and have a burning desire to make services better for their patients. But some fantastic leaders of general practice have come out of that commissioning group process, and thanks very much for all of that. But this is just the time, in a sense, where that leadership really needs to stand up, and we all need to support and help it as we go through. The challenges are not getting easier, but it's so important that those clinical commissioning groups have the freedom, the ability, the resources to make the kinds of changes that we know we need to make to service. So commissioning, a critical part of all of that. And if you think about it in really simple terms, the sustainability of the NHS, both financially but also in terms of getting great outcomes, there are two broad things that we need to do. One of them is we need to concentrate and centralise and specialise services where we know there's great evidence for it working. So not everywhere can we do everything. We need to make those really important decisions like paediatric cardiac surgery, and there's a whole series of other decisions that we collectively need to make that happen. But also to turn the kind of rhetoric around prevention, both primary and secondary prevention, into reality on the ground. If we continue in the way that we are doing, pushing more and more patients into hospital, the NHS will go bust in the relatively near future. So redesigning services around patients to shift the balance from hospital to community services to get upstream with our patients is absolutely central to all of that. So commissioning is an important part of making that a reality. But just by saying that, you know as well as I do, the kind of really significant decisions that you need to make that a reality. We also have to look at the provision of primary care across the country. There is fantastic general practice out there. Many of you will be working in that environment. Many of you will be working in those practices. But we also know there is a significant and unacceptable variation in general practice across the country. Now, I'm not one of those who say that therefore we have to do bad things to people. We need to support and help people get to that place. Indeed, variation in itself is not a bad thing. Variation is a mechanism for getting innovation into the system. But there really are some practices that are very poor, and we need to work collectively together, either to help them where we can or to replace them when we need to. That attack on variation is going to be critical. The other issue I think we need to tackle is how we work together across general practice. We're going through this rather, I think, anodyne arrangement in terms of hospital provision, where everyone seems to want to merge with everyone else, and somehow that big is in itself beautiful. The evidence doesn't necessarily support it, but what it does support is that you get better outcomes when people work in partnership together. So we need to think how we can support and develop practices and primary care organisations working together in partnership to get great outcomes for our patients. But also we need to understand we're not all wisdom sits with us. We don't know absolutely everything. Though we can learn lots of things, both from the not-for-profit sector and also, dare I say it, from the profit sector as well. But we need to keep them in their place. We need to make sure that when we use those ideas and influences, we do it in order to improve quality, not as some kind of dogmatic response to the needs of our patients and the services that they require. So provision, we need to tackle that. We also need to think very carefully about the variation in the offer that's given to patients from primary care. On the one hand, we know there are practices that are incredibly open to their patients, using all the various, dare I say it, electronic means to make that a reality. And we know there are great practices who are focusing on things like homelessness and services for those people who we have difficulty connecting with. We need to learn those lessons. We need to understand how that works across the system. We need to connect those people together. We need to make it a reality so that everybody has the opportunity to book online, to see their records, to do all of those things that we take for granted in other parts of our lives, whilst not losing the focus that we have on those deprived populations. So that is essentially the centre of what we need to do. Now, we need to do that with ambition, and we need to do it using innovation. And general practice has a fantastic record of innovation. You know, the world is full of innovations from general practice in this country. The issue for us, though, and this is where the college and educationalists and the NHS overall need to work, is that we haven't particularly been good at making sure that all of our patients, as rapidly as possible, get the benefit of those innovations. So how we do that, I think, is a great challenge. And the second area is ambition. How can we get ambition into the system? And I perfectly understand, in circumstances where people are under pressure, that suddenly trying to put your head above the parapet and give that central direction, that kind of ambition, is very difficult. But I point you to what a group of clinical commissioning groups are trying to do in northwest London at the moment. It is remarkable what they're attempting to deliver for their for their patients. They're going through a consultation process about it at the moment, so who knows what the kind of final outcome is. But their level of ambition is to invest over £180 million on primary and community services for those populations, and to close over 700 hospital beds as part of that. That is ambition. And in a sense, the issue for us, particularly if you work at a practice, is how you can connect together to create that ambition. Because it's ambition of that scale that will make the NHS sustainable as we go, financially and clinically sustainable as we go forward over the next few years. So, finally, back to purpose and that Olympic ceremony and that idea about the NHS being a social movement, being the people, the principles, the values, all connected together, something enormously powerful. The challenge to us is how do we turn all of that into financial and clinical sustainability? I'm absolutely convinced we've got the people, we've got the brain power, we've got the commitment in the NHS amongst the people who work to make it a reality. And I'm absolutely committed to working with you and the college over the next few years to make those aspirations, that purpose, a reality in practice.